It provides a cultural opportunity for students as well as the community to explore the rich heritage of St. Bernard and the New Orleans area. Well, let's get on with tonight's event. To introduce the lecturer, I would like to introduce Mr. Brian Keating, who's the Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs here at Nunez Community College. So let's have a hand for Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Curtis. Curtis mentioned we're continuing to improve at Nunez, and we got some new lights, and we've cleaned up our mascot a little bit. But I'd also like to congratulate Curtis. Curtis is now Dr. Manning. He completed the requirements for his PhD over the Christmas holidays at the University of New Orleans, so congratulations. Also, it gives me a lot of pleasure tonight. Usually the person doing the introduction is Dr. Warner, our Chancellor. And he, I believe, has only missed 2 history lecture series introductions in the entire history of the program. Tonight he is in Kentucky visiting community colleges there with other chancellors from Louisiana to find what they're doing and maybe bring back some best practices to us. But so it's not very often that I get to take this spot and take advantage of him not being here. But again, on his behalf, I would like to welcome all of you to the Nunez Auditorium tonight and to the History Lecture Series. Tonight's topic, we have a guest speaker. She is a professor of English at Delgado Community College, has authored many books, one or more of which we use in our history courses here at Nunez. And we'll be speaking about free men of color, and it's part of our Black History Month and the celebration for Black History Month across the state. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Ms. Mary Gehman. Can you? Because the books are used in our courses and are available in a bookstore, we do have books in the lobby, and she will be signing any books that are purchased after the series is over. Oh, I can't. That light, I'm not used to having that light. All yours, Mary.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I was warned that this is a little island out here, and I shouldn't get too wild and moving around. I'll fall off the side. It's really a privilege to be here and part of this long-running St. Bernard History Lecture Series, and also to address you on a topic that has often been overlooked in our local and state history, the free people of color. I'd like to first thank Curtis Manning for arranging for me to speak this evening, and to Ron Chapman, another history professor here at Nunez, for putting together the PowerPoint presentation used tonight from my old slide collection. It's really nice to see the old slides being put up into such a fancy format. I'd also like to say a word of appreciation to Alberta and Jim Lewis, who are with us tonight. They're the owners of the nearby Sebastopol Plantation, which is open for tours, and to Bill Hyland, local historian, the folks at the Ducros Isleños Museum, and Elizabeth McDougall, director of St. Bernard's Office of Tourism. All of these people assisted me in one way or another during the research for my most recent book, Touring Louisiana's Great River Road, and it covers the Mississippi River from Angola North to Venice South, which means it includes Araby, St. Bernard, and Plaquemine Parish. That was published late 2003, and it's available for sale out in the lobby. I should mention that all my books are out there, and I'll be signing afterwards if anybody would like to have a personal touch to the books. The people I mentioned made me aware of a history and of people and places along this stretch of the river, which is information often not readily available in written sources on St. Bernard. And it was truly a pleasure to come down here and to explore the beautiful Bayou Road along Bayou LeBeuf, the communities out in Wyclosky and Delacroix, and the settlements on St. Bernard Highway. That research has helped me better understand how this parish developed, and I'll be using some of that information in my lecture tonight. Now, because I'm not that familiar with PowerPoint, and you saw how Mr. Manning had a little problem up here, I'm going to, and I do have a series of slides, but I'm going to be giving just a general overview of the topic, the Free People of Color of St. Bernard, New Orleans. And then after that, I'll go through the slides. I think that way we can concentrate, first of all, on the information, and then you'll be seeing a number of images of the things that I referred to in this introduction. The Free People of Color, or les gens de couleur libre, as they were known, in St. Bernard and in New Orleans upriver, I should explain, first of all, what it means to be a person of color who was free, not enslaved, and in many cases had never known enslavement. We are all somewhat influenced when we think of history of American slavery by the accounts of that period as told in history books in school, in novels like Little Tom's Cabin, and in documentaries about the Civil War. All of these were written and produced by Northerners from their perspective, with little, if any, mention of the very different situation here in Louisiana. I say very different because this state, with its current boundaries and before the vast Louisiana Territory, does not fit into the Mayflower / First Thanksgiving / Puritan Protestant British colony traditions. The French and later the Spanish settlers in Louisiana had their own worldview, borrowed heavily from the Latin Catholic culture of their native countries in Europe and from colonies they had already long established in the Caribbean. Even in physical appearance, the majority, with dark hair, flashing black eyes, olive-colored skin, resembled more the indigenous people in the West Indies, or those mixed with some African a generation or two, more than the more Teutonic look of the British, Germans, and Scotch-Irish on the eastern seaboard. That this difference affected the view of slavery in Louisiana should not surprise us. In the early years of the colony, there was a sense of enslavement as a temporary condition. I should repeat that. In the early years of the Louisiana colony, the French colony, there was the sense of enslavement as a temporary condition, one from which a person was expected to graduate or to move out of after a term of faithful service. Avenues of freedom through the years varied according to the period, but it was not uncommon for a master to free all or some of his slaves upon his death, or to free a slave woman with whom he had fathered children, granting a free status to the children as well. Slaves who served valiantly in battle and survived were granted their freedom as a reward. Under the Spanish, there was the institution of coartación, which meant the ability of a slave to buy his own freedom with money borrowed or earned from hiring himself out or selling products he had made or grown. Once free, the person had all the rights of a white man, to engage in business, to travel freely, and to live and work as he chose. Only 3 rights, and these were considerable, were denied him: the right to vote, the right to hold political office, and the right to marry a white person. He also had to put the initials FMC after his signature to indicate free man of color. Women put FWC, free woman of color, and then sometimes one sees in the records FPC, meaning free people of color. And of course, those had their French equivalents as well. And when one looks through the records of the colonial period and on into the 1830s, in fact, and 1840s, it's very easy to distinguish who was of color, who was classified of color, according to the courts and the church and so on. Being Catholic, the French and Spanish believed Africans had souls just like everyone else and needed to be baptized, taught the catechism, and given absolution. They also tried in their laws and often in practice to keep slave families together, encouraged them to be married by a priest, and to legitimize their children. African slaves were permitted to keep their native language and names and use them along with acquiring a working knowledge of French and a Christian French name. In New Orleans, Congo Square still exists, an area outside the city's walls where slaves on Sunday, their day off, could dance their native dances, play music on instruments they fashioned by hand, and interact with slaves from their own and other tribes from Africa. Given these major differences, and I hope we can see by now how different the whole institution of slavery was here as compared to other parts of the South, given these differences from the way slaves were viewed and treated in other parts of the South, it is also not surprising that Louisiana soon developed a significant population of freed slaves, which was constantly augmented by free black immigrants, refugees from the Haitian uprising in the first decade of the 1800s, Africans who worked on ships in and out of the port in New Orleans and smaller ports along the Gulf Coast, and personal servants of French families who moved here from Europe or from the Caribbean. At the time of the Louisiana Purchase and statehood for Louisiana, nearly a third of the population in and around New Orleans was free people of color. Nearly a third. Many having free parents and free grandparents. Is it any wonder then that in 1815, speaking a little closer to home here, Andrew Jackson depended on 2 battalions of free men of color, commanded by a captain of their own ranks, Joseph Savary, to help win the Battle of New Orleans. By the mid-1830s, free people of color numbered in the tens of thousands, owned $2.5 million in real estate in the New Orleans area alone, and dominated the building, ironworking, and leatherworking trades, among others. They owned plantations along the Mississippi from Point Coupee down to Pointe La Hache, and along smaller rivers out in Natchitoches, Cane River, New Iberia, St. Martinville. There were cowboys and ranchers out in Opelousas, what was then called the Attakapas, running and owning herds of cattle. Throughout Louisiana, they founded and staffed their own schools, had their own social organizations to help with medical and burial costs, their own clubs for socializing and dating. They had their own newspapers and their own political gatherings. They were, in short, a community to be reckoned with. One of the anomalies that often shocks people about this history is that many of the free people of color owned slaves. They bought and sold them and saw trading in slaves and real estate as the 2 major avenues to wealth, just as many whites did at the time. It is fair to say that a good number of these free people of color owned only a few slaves as servants in their homes, and not uncommonly, they bought enslaved relatives in order to later free them. But as planters and businessmen, they also participated in the slave trade for profit and as a source of cheap labor. We have nothing written, and this is very unfortunate, we have nothing written in their own hand as to how they felt about this, nor are there any first-hand accounts of how they treated their slaves. We can only speculate that with them, as in the general white slave-owning population, some masters and mistresses were kind and generous, while others definitely were not. The other unique aspect of this history is plissage, the common liaisons between white men and women of color. Because there was a shortage of marriageable white women in the Louisiana Territory from the earliest years, French men and later Spanish took up with local Indian women, slave women or free women of color. Again here, the Latin Catholic mentality differed from the Calvinistic Protestant view of illegitimacy and paternity. The French and Spanish men considered all their children, regardless of status at birth, as their own. Usually they gave them their own last names, freed them if they were born of a slave mother, and provided finances for their education and well-being. And there are many, many records of this. Because an illegitimate child or a natural child, which was a term used in legal documents, that child could not inherit property or money from his or her white father, these men often set aside a considerable amount of money in their wills to be given to a trusted friend who would then pass it on to the family of color. Many white men had no heirs except their children of color. Sometimes they acknowledged them in the will and granted them property, but if any white relative contested this plan, the courts generally ruled in favor of the white relatives. A lot has been made about the quadroon balls and the beauty of the women of color. We have very few descriptions of either, and none of those writers were from Louisiana nor from the community of free people of color themselves. There were balls held at which young free women of color danced with white men who were looking for a mistress, and we're talking about New Orleans. How many and how often these balls were held cannot be documented. The young women were looking for a protector, a white man with financial means who would support them and their future children together. And the young bachelors with whom they danced sought the companionship and homemaking skills of a woman. Usually the men did not live with the women of color, but they visited them frequently in homes provided by the young man or his father. If the bachelor later married a white woman of his own economic class, he would either break off the relationship with the woman of color or, as often happened, continue visiting her from time to time in a less public way. Well, what happened to the large community of free people of color during and after the Civil War? Just prior to that momentous event, thousands of them left Louisiana. Young men and their wives, in cases of marriage, were urged to seek their future in France, Haiti, or Mexico, wherever their families had relatives, property, or business connections, which many of them had. I have researched the hundreds of families of color who emigrated to Mexico in the late 1850s. I'll be showing you some slides of this, and met a number of their descendants. Many free men of color fought with the Union, while a good many joined the Confederacy to protect a way of life that they shared with white Southerners. After the war, the intelligentsia of the free men of color stood poised to take leadership in the integrated local and state government under Reconstruction. For a brief, heady decade following emancipation, they served in political positions, used what means they had that had been salvaged from the war to promote education and jobs for the newly freed slaves, and consolidated their influence in Washington. I think a little-known fact is that their newspaper, the Tribune, published in New Orleans, was read in Congress every day as the official voice of Southern blacks. But Reconstruction ended in 1876. Federal troops left Louisiana, and the free people of color had to make a difficult choice. There was another wave of emigration out of the country, but others with light skin and European features who could pass for white moved to other areas of the parish or state and lived as white. Eventually, many moved out west, where color was less of an issue. Those who could not do that, either because of dark skin or because their allegiances lay with their families and community, became identified as black or Negro. Under the Jim Crow laws that institutionalized segregation by race in the late 1890s and early 1900s, the former free people of color who remained in New Orleans and outlying areas withdrew into their own neighborhoods. In New Orleans, they lived primarily in the 7th Ward, or what is called Treme. In smaller communities along the river, down in this direction, they had their own family groups, which eventually became intermarried with American blacks. Interestingly, it was from these communities that leadership in the civil rights movement emerged in the 1960s. It is not a coincidence that Martin Luther King and a group of local ministers founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in a Baptist church, where? In Central City, New Orleans. And that civil rights leaders like Andrew Young and Avery Alexander were natives of the city. In the 1970s, political heavyweights like Dutch Morial, Chink Henry, Israel Augustine, and Sidney Bartholomew, to name a few, all came from the long line of free people of color activists. A word here about the term Creole. Free people of color and slaves born in Louisiana, baptized Catholic and speaking French, have always considered themselves Creoles. The language they developed in Louisiana, based on French, but influenced also by African, Spanish, and later English words and cadence, was and still is known as Creole, Louisiana Creole. Their cooking for themselves and their French masters or employers was called Creole cuisine. Their music, fashioned by the classic European masters, but including some of the local influences of African, West Indian, Mexican, and Cuban instruments and tempos, was known as Creole music and contributed heavily to the birth of jazz. The first jazz bands to go upriver, you might recall, and to New York, headed up by men like King Oliver, were called Creole jazz bands. Along with the French-Spanish aristocracy in Louisiana, who were also called Creoles, the free people of color shared a common language, culture, religion, and worldview. It was only in modern times, since about 1900, that Northern journalists began to refer to Creoles in terms of color. Even today, the phrase Creole of color is a misnomer in the sense that Creole transcends race and means simply anyone whose roots in Louisiana go back to colonial days. What about free people of color in St. Bernard Parish? I'm going to give just a few examples here and then move on to the slides. St. Bernard has always been closely related to New Orleans, historically with commercial and social ties, not to mention family ties. Therefore, there were, of course, free people of color here, just as in New Orleans. Their numbers were smaller and their influence probably less noticeable. They were planters and owned or had connections to a number of plantations. And I should mention here that this history has really not been researched very much, and I'm hoping in the future years that there will be more written about that, the families and so on. But to give you a few examples, Pierre Clément de la Satte, the French colonial prefect and commissioner in New Orleans during the Louisiana Purchase, in 1803 describes in his memoirs of the time, this is 1803 now, a trip by boat up the Mississippi from the Belize, the river's mouth, past Fort Plaquemine, later renamed Fort St. Philip, at what is today Buras. He was given meals and put up for the night at several plantations along the way to New Orleans. The landscape, according to La Satte, was, quote, thick wooded riverbanks, a few miserable shacks, lush variegated vegetation, and no road other than the paths made by wild animals and hunters. We forget, I think, how remote many of these areas once were. He comments that the Duplessis plantation, which was 11 leagues, or roughly 33 miles from New Orleans, downriver, was not wealthy, but the proprietor was hospitable, serving La Satte and his entourage a breakfast of café au lait, eggs, and pigeons. I guess he means squab. La Satte adds that Duplessis was like many of the planters in that remote area, who were unmarried but had lots of mulatto children at their tables. In the case of Duplessis, La Satte notes 10 such children. In some cases, the planter had taken up with an Indian woman, and La Satte comments on the, quote, sallow-skinned, half-savage, unquote, children in those households. From Duplessis's house to New Orleans was a series of relay posts along the riverbank, guarded by mounted military troops, or dragoons. Thus, if the river was too high, people and goods could be transported over land to and from the city. Now, another example is Mary Plantation, one of 3 plantation houses still standing in a road just below the settlement of Dalcourt, down LA 39, and the other 2 are Stella and Promised Land. In the mid-1800s, Mary, we at least know about Mary Plantation. I don't have history on the other 2. I assume they're somewhat similar, but I don't have proof of that. In the mid-1800s, Mary Plantation was owned by Josephine Tassie Mathey, free woman of color. Her mother, Françoise Lalonde, also known as Perrault, had children with Joseph Tassie, that's T-A-S-S-Y, sometimes spelled T-A-S-S-I, a white planter in the 1790s. On Tassie's death, Mary Plantation went, and we're not sure when it got the name Mary, and we don't know for whom the Mary, it was named, what Mary. But on his death, the plantation, whatever its name was then, went to his daughter Josephine. She married Simeon Mathey, a free man of color. Their son Simeon Mathey inherited the plantation. He was living there when the 1910 census was taken and is believed to be the last of the line to occupy the property. What's interesting is in 1900, the census lists him as black, while by 1910, the census has him as white. This information was given to me by a descendant of Josephine Tassie. I think she's in Chicago, as I recall, and she hopes one day to visit the plantation she heard about as a child from the elders in her family. Another example is Sebastopol Plantation down the road off Judge Perez Drive. It's another local plantation with a connection with free people of color. Colonel Ignatius Szymanski arrived in New Orleans around 1842. Eventually, he owned a cotton press and an oil company. From the Lewises, the current owners of Sebastopol, I have learned that the colonel Colonel Szymanski owned that plantation from 1848 till 1855, and in fact gave it its name to mark a famous Russian battle. Szymanski never married, but he had children with a free woman of color, Eliza Romaine. The children were born during the period of Szymanski's ownership of Sebastopol, and very likely lived there. On Szymanski's death in 1874, his considerable estate went to the sole surviving son, John Szymanski, who 2 years later sold his assets in Louisiana, this is now the late 1870s, and moved to Tampico, Mexico, where he married a Mexican woman and became a successful businessman, one of the founders of the modern oil-rich city of Tampico at the turn of the century. His mother and her brother accompanied him to Mexico. And then the final note on St. Bernard and its population of free people of color is Fazinville, a community of 30 families that existed in Chalmette on the boundary between the Chalmette battlefield and the National Cemetery from approximately 1856 to 1964, in other words, over a century. Much of the land that served as the battlefield in the Battle of New Orleans, might surprise you to hear, was owned by free people of color, beginning with Joseph Sauvanet, later Hilaire Saint-Amand, and eventually Pierre Fazan, a rice planter. His son, also named Pierre Fazan, sold off plots of land to free people of color in the area, and the community soon developed into a self-sufficient village with a church, school, and grocery store. In the mid-1960s, the federal government decided to appropriate the Fazinville land in order to join the battlefield and the National Cemetery. Residents and homeowners in the village were given mere months to vacate their homes and land and accept compensation far below the actual market value. Most of them moved to Orleans Parish and the lower Ninth Ward. Families associated with Fazinville include Cager, Pierre, Dunmore, Lawrence, Charles, and Matoyer. And Ron Chapman, who teaches history here, just published an article in Louisiana Life magazine about Fazinville. So anyone interested in reading more about that is welcome to do so. Okay, let's look at the slides then. You'll see images now of many of the people and places that I mentioned in the talk. And I'm going to try to do this with the least amount of interruptions. Okay, let's see. Okay, that's a picture of the book, The Free People of Color of New Orleans. And it was published in 1994, so it's been out on the market over 10 years, and I'm very pleased that it's been used by a lot of students, a lot of people also finding out for the first time what it means to have roots in Louisiana that are in some way intertwined with free people of color. Now, let me see if I can, no, we're going forward, okay. This is a group that this past year formed a Creole society called La Creole. It's capital L-A for Louisiana, La Creole. And these are people from New Orleans and the New Orleans area. And all of them have obviously descendants in the community that I was talking about. One of the most distinct African influences in New Orleans is this building that is right in front of City Hall in Duncan Plaza, and it's called the African House, and it is modeled after the African House on Melrose Plantation along Cane River near Natchitoches. And anybody who's visited Melrose has seen this building very similar to this. It is, as far as we know, it is the only building with actual African style that still exists in Louisiana, and then that's why the replica was made to be here in New Orleans. Melrose Plantation, incidentally, was built by a free woman of color and her sons. This is Congo Square, which is, I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's a very nicely inlaid stone circle outside the Municipal Auditorium. It's in Armstrong Park. And this is the spot that I told you where the slaves were allowed to practice their dances and music and so on Sundays. Here's a typical Creole cottage where many of the free women of color that I mentioned who had liaisons, and also many families of free people of color, whether or not there was any connection with a white man, They often lived in these modest but very nicely appointed houses with lovely courtyards in the back. And we still have many examples of those today. Another construction would have been the plantation home. This is Mary Plantation that I mentioned, where Josephine Tassie and her family lived. This is Fazanville that I just finished talking about. And I believe in the foreground is the river, and in the background is St. Bernard Highway. And you can see the many houses and buildings that line the one avenue or the one street that led from the river up to St. Bernard Highway. And in the foreground is a water treatment plant that still stands there today. This is a group from Straight University, 1915 graduating class. And Straight University was one of 3 institutions of higher learning that were merged into Dillard University. And this is A.P. Turo, very well-known civil rights lawyer in the late 50s, early 60s, and his name, of course, continues. We have Turo Street, Turo Avenue in New Orleans, and also there's a statue of him near Turo Avenue and St. Bernard in New Orleans. Here is Arnold Bertineau, who was an activist, a political activist, pre-Civil War. He fought with the Corps d'Afrique, which was a corps of free men of color and some slaves or freed slaves at that point in the battle, in the Civil War, in Port Hudson, upriver obviously from here. And also, during the Civil War, he and a man named Rudinez went up to Washington to Abraham Lincoln, and with them they took a petition with 500 signatures of free men of color from the New Orleans area, all of them saying, we are free men, we have always been free, we have property, we are educated, we demand the right to vote. Of course, this was in, I believe it was 63. It was not politic at that time for Abraham Lincoln to grant them their wish, and so they were sent on their way, and they went to Boston and were celebrities among the abolitionists there for several weeks and then returned to New Orleans. His granddaughter, incidentally, contacted me and was very happy to find out some of the places. She grew up in California, had no idea the history of the family, and she came. She's the one who gave me the portrait of her father. I was very happy to get that. Okay, here's a name that has died out in Louisiana, Tinchon. Jacques Tinchon and his wife Elizabeth Vincent, or Vincent as it was pronounced. And you'll notice that they were born in the very early 1800s, late 1700s, and died toward the end of that century of the 1800s. They were from New Orleans, married here. They had a large cigar factory here in the city. They also had a son, Jules Tinchon. They had 4 sons, actually, and 2 of them, right before the Civil War, when there was the migration out of the city, they moved with their 2 sons to Belgium, to Europe, and opened a large cigar factory, and I've been told by their descendants that they actually sold and made cigars for the czars and the kings of Europe during that time. Their sons, Jules and Jose, or Joseph, Jose Tinchon, who married Stephanie Gonzalez, also of New Orleans. They married here. Those 2 sons went to Mexico and opened a cigar factory there. The cigar factory lasted for quite a while, but then it burned, and eventually Joseph, or Jose, and his wife and family went to Belgium and joined the family there. Jules, we don't know what happened to him. Now, speaking of Mexico, I wanted to tell you just a little bit about my research there. I've been there 4 different times, different summers, and as I said, I've met some of the members, descendants of people from here. And the area, I hope you can see this, it's a little bit blurred, but the area of settlement for people from here, free people of color, was between Tampico to the north, the port of Tampico, and then Veracruz, the port of Veracruz to the south. And they settled in both of those port cities and then in various villages along the Gulf. When you think about it, the trade route was at New Orleans, Veracruz, which was a very large port at that point, and then, of course, Havana, Cuba, and then back and forth. There were ships literally leaving every day, multiple ships leaving from those various ports and making the commercial voyages, and then, of course, lots of passengers as well. Here's the cover of a contract that was made in 1858 by a man named Louis Nelson Fouché here in New Orleans. He contracted with a family in near Tampico in Mexico to purchase land and resettle 100 families. That's what the contract explains. 100 families to bring to Mexico, and they were going to grow rice and cotton and tobacco and ship it back to Louisiana. That was the plan. It was called the Eureka Colony. And actually, I had the great pleasure of meeting a woman whose family sold them the land. And if I can get my pointer working here, it's supposed to be, okay. There's a sort of potato-like area there. This is a very poor map. Oh dear, we lost the map. Okay, it's a poor map. It's poorly drawn in pencil, and it's not very, but anyway, you get the idea where the land was. It was a large piece, and there is a river running down here into the Gulf below Tampico, and the idea was that they would have access to that river and ship their goods out through the river. The woman whose family, I'll show you her picture a little bit later, whose family sold them the land, later bought the land back because 3 years after they started the settlement, we don't know how many families were actually resettled there, although I have a list of probably about a dozen that I'm fairly sure were part of that. Unfortunately, no records exist of this anymore, but the colony was burned. And when you think about it, these were French-speaking people coming from United States, and of course, this was the time of the French invasion in Mexico. So although the free people of color from Louisiana had nothing to do with the French invasion, they were sort of caught up in that same period and were probably not well liked by certain Spanish elements in the country. Now, this is a little bit further south from Tampico. In fact, it's about 300 miles south. It's about 100 miles north of Veracruz. And why it's important, first of all, you see the brown pelicans, and I like that shot because it reminds me so much of the Louisiana coast as well. And a lot of the climate and everything is very similar to what we have here. But behind, in the background, is the confluence of the Gulf and the river Tecolutla. And this is where a group, after Reconstruction, they left Opelousas, New Iberia, a large family group, and they went and settled down along the Tecolutla River. I have some pictures of them. And this is another shot of that beach, and you can see a house there and the tall palm trees. Very much a part of the Caribbean and tropical isle. This is from a magazine. It's, again, I apologize for the quality of some of these reproductions, but it was a pen and ink drawing of the wharf and the docks in Veracruz, the port of Veracruz, in 1918, I believe this is. And so you get sort of a feeling of how primitive a lot of the area was when they landed there. This was not it was a large port, but it was not what we consider a modern type of port as we have it today. This is in Veracruz, the city of Veracruz, and it's the Zocalo, or the town square, and you'll notice there are Spanish-style buildings, Spanish colonial-style buildings, which remind us in some cases of the Cabildo and other buildings that we have here. A lot of the architecture reminded me very much of colonial architecture here. And that's me sitting at a park where I was staying in the hotel, sort of off to the right here. And this is in Tampico. We're going back and forth a little bit. I hope I don't confuse you. But what impressed me about this whole row of buildings was I looked out on the balcony and I thought I was on Decatur Street. It had so much of a feeling of Louisiana and a look. I learned later, this is the modern section of Tampico that I told you about, the Semanskys and so on, and they actually hired New Orleans architects to go down there and to plan the new modern city around the turn of the century when oil was discovered in that general area. And this building, can you believe it, is made of cypress weatherboards and cypress logs that were milled here and then put on ship and shipped down with the families. They knew they were going to a place that had the same climate conditions, the same awful termites and that kind of thing, and so they thought cypress was the wood to take with them, and of course at that time cypress was very plentiful. This building is in a small town named Gutierrez, Zamora, where there are a lot of Louisiana descendants living. And when I took this picture, they said, "Oh no, that's such an awful looking building. You don't want to show that to people back home." And I said, "Are you kidding? That looks very familiar. We have buildings in New Orleans that look like that." But I was just amazed at the architecture and the building materials that they had actually thought to take all those things and had the ability on ships and so on to take them with them. Here's a register that I found in Tampico. It's dated 1867. It is a register of foreigners living in Tampico requesting a card, a security card, which is similar to a passport. In other words, that they could use that to travel throughout the country. And inside that ledger, this is just an example of the kinds of things that exist down there to show us the presence of many of the people that left from here. And I know you can't see the names, but there's a Cavalier Soto. There are 2 or 3 La Bourdette. These are names. In Mexico, there's never any designation of race. So it took somebody who was fairly familiar with these names to see that indeed these were people who, the same Jules Cavalier who had been in New Orleans. He disappears, obviously, from the records in New Orleans and then reappears in Mexico. And again, I apologize for the quality of this, but somebody sent it to me, so I'm sort of stuck with it. But it's a newspaper clipping, I believe it's 1998, and it is of a family reunion in that small town of Gutierrez, Zamora, which is near the Tecolutla River that I told you about earlier. And if you can read the top, it says it's a family reunion of the 5 families, Vincent, Olivier, Decuir, Pinta, and Lachule. And anybody who's from Opelousas and the New Iberia area is going to be very familiar with those names. And that's where these people come from. What is significant, as you can see, it's a group of a couple hundred people. And they still get together, and they still are very close family ties. They intermarry a great deal, and they still share a lot of the same culture that was brought there. Here, for example, in the cemetery in that small town, the tombstones are in French, and of course it's in Mexico, so it's quite interesting. This is Rita Olivier, and she died in 1909. And it says that she was born in New Iberia, the United States, in 1882. This is Garfield Lachule in that same small town. I asked them if they cooked gumbo, and they were a little quizzical. I didn't know the Spanish word for gumbo, and I didn't know the Spanish word for okra either. But eventually we figured out, yes, they call it bombo, and like B-O-M-B-O, and okra, they call okra, actually. And okra is available throughout Mexico, but it's not very commonly eaten. Whereas in these small towns where there are a lot of Louisiana people, they still eat okra. And Garfield Lachule had, his courtyard was like a jungle, but he was very proud to go out and find his okra plant and show it to me. So I had to take a picture of that. Here's a marriage certificate. It's from St. Nicholas Church in Patouville, Louisiana, which is out near New Iberia. And it's 1878, the marriage of Aristide Olivier and Elizabeth Decuir. And of course, this marriage certificate I was shown in Mexico. It was kind of odd. I would have expected to find it in Louisiana, but many of the families still have some of these documents. They were not aware, the younger people were not aware of their history. They didn't really know why they had left Louisiana, and they were quite interested to find out what the history was and where they got some of the words and so on that they use. Obviously came from the Old French. I found that there was nobody speaking French anymore. There weren't even any lullabies or anything like that in French, which sort of surprised me. But I think they become so Mexicanized that they no longer keep those things. This is a family group, Bernard Vincent and his wife Celeste Sims. This is about in the 1890s this photo was taken. Some of the children were born in New Iberia and Opelousas area, and some of them were born in Mexico. And the man standing in the back is a tutor for the family, for the children, because there were no schools in that very small, remote area. And they had 3 older sons who were away at the time because they were in school in the capital, where there was a school of higher education. Now, Bernard Vincent and his wife, I have their tomb here. You notice Celeste Sims and Bernard Vincent. This is in that town in Mexico. Bernard Vincent DeLille. His mother was a DeLille. And it was through that I was able to make the connection that, okay, here's the cemetery. I'll come back to that in a minute, but the cemetery in that small town where I showed you the tombs, you'll notice that it's very hilly, so it's hard to get a perspective on it, but you'll notice that many of the tombs, they're like little houses, very similar to what our cemeteries here look like. Back to the DeLille situation, I think some of you are aware of Henriette DeLille here on the right. She was the founder of the Sisters of the Holy Family, which was an order of religious women. And that was 1843, I think it was, that she founded the order. It turns out that she is now being considered for canonization in the Vatican. And the Sisters of the Holy Family are looking for descendants of her brother and sister and trying to piece together her family history. And lo and behold, there in Gutierrez, Zamora, Mexico, I found the daughters of Bernard Vincent. You see them, I don't remember the names, and one is Celeste, right, Celeste and Marta. Gomez Vincent. Vincent would be their family name, or their father's name, and Gomez. No, these are granddaughters, I guess, of Bernard Vincent, right. Their mother's name was Vincent, and Gomez is their, I think I have it confused there. But one of them is Vincent and one is Gomez. And so you notice there's the Spanish and the French connection there. And then their niece, Adriana, is speaking with Archbishop Hughes at the time. This, I believe, is in 1998. I don't have the date on it. In any case, they were brought to Louisiana by the Sisters of the Holy Family to tell about the connections that they had in Mexico, the family history and so on. And it was a wonderful visit that they had here. Sebastopol Plantation, this is a picture of the sign that is out at the highway, is the plantation I told you about, the Colonel Szymanski, and that's where he lived, and the house is in the background. It's not too easy to see. Many of you probably are familiar with it. You'll notice the date is, it was built around 1830. And this is a Szymanski family group in Tampico. Very lovely people, very generous, and spent quite a bit of time with me talking about their history and what they knew of it. And they have all done very well. In the next picture, you'll notice this is the sisters, 4 sisters. There are, I think, about 11 children in that generation. In the center is Maria Luisa Herrera Casasus, and she's the woman whose family sold the Eureka land to Fouché back in 1858. So we're sort of sitting around trying to piece this all together. And in the background, if you can see here on the right, is the portrait of the Archbishop of the state of Tamaulipas, which is where Tampico is located, and he is a Szymanski also. So the family is quite renowned in Mexico. This is a family group going back now to Gutierrez, Zamora, the small town that I was telling you about near Veracruz, and their family name is Probo. And we realized it's Provost in Louisiana, and it has changed to Probo in Mexico. And this was a setting where I was meeting with various family groups, and so they posed for this picture, and they were very pleased to find out about their Louisiana connections. This is Leah DeQueer seated in a wheelchair. She's elderly and has lost a leg to diabetes, but her mind is very sharp, and I sat several hours with her. She just had all the names and the dates and so on from the family. It was really wonderful. Behind her are 2 of her sons. Her grandson is directly behind her, and the man sort of in the middle is Azael Olivier. He's a nephew. Behind them is the Tekaluta River that I told you about. And they have lived there in that same town, pretty much in the same property, since the late 1800s. And I'm ending the slideshow here with a meeting, again, of some of the same family groups in Gutierrez, Zamora. And the woman, the second from the left, seated, her name is Julieta Pinta. And she is the owner and the chef of a lovely restaurant in this small town, and it's called Doña Pilar's Restaurant, named for her mother, who started it in the 1930s. And Doña Julieta, we were sitting there talking, and I told her she absolutely has to meet Leah Chase from Dookie's Chases, because Doña Julieta in Mexico, she has all the recipes, and she has a lot of the old Louisiana Creole cuisine that we're talking about, some of those recipes. She wasn't familiar with everything, but a lot of them she remembered her mother especially cooking, and some of the things are lost, obviously, through the years. But these are all relatives of hers standing around. There's Aziel Olivier, again, with his wife and daughter, sort of toward the center, and he is the last of the ranchers of the Louisiana people. Originally, they bought up a lot of really wonderful land and fertile land there, but they've sold a lot of it. They grew tobacco. That didn't work. Eventually, they had orange groves. That's pretty much what they're doing now, is growing oranges, and the pulp is then shipped to other countries and it's used for orange juice and that sort of thing. So that just gives you an idea, hopefully, of not only New Orleans and St. Bernard, but also all the way down to Mexico. We have these connections that we're finally piecing the puzzle together. I hope you've enjoyed those slides and the information. Thank you. And I understand there will be a question-answer period later, and I'll be more than happy to entertain any questions. This stays here, right? Okay. Thanks. Thank you.
I want to thank you. It was such a great honor for me personally, because I've been using Mary's books in my classes, and I'd like to make this presentation to you from the History Lecture Series as a thank you for taking your time and visiting with us and educating us.
Maybe I should hold it this way.
That's all right. I think we got it.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Again, I'd like to thank Ms. Mary Graham. She's done such a wonderful job for us. Let's give her another hand, please. Okay, next order of business, it's time to begin looking at the possible topics. Coming up, if you can believe it or not, is our 5th season. So the next few months, we'll be drafting the list of lectures we'll be using for the next year. So if you go in the back, as you leave here, you'll find there's a list of topics. So please check off the ones in the order that you'd like to have them. And then add some, if you have some other ideas outside of the ones we've suggested, just please feel free to put them in. Because in April, we'll be meeting then and deciding what the itinerary will be for the next time out. So with that, I want to thank everyone for attending, and later on we'll get on to the questions. But thank you so much. This is the History Lecture Series.